series, almost always convene here at the LBJ School. This year, we've linked that series up with our Brumley Graduate Fellowship Program, which is an opportunity for students from across the graduate schools of our university, I do mean all parts of the university, who competed for selection in the process, were selected to work on the various Strauss Center research programs. And in every instance, a particular person who is selected into the program is then asked, who would you most like to see come to speak to this campus, who would be relevant to your research and of interest to the larger UT and Austin communities. Today's guest speaker is jointly invited in that sense by Sam and Arub. We're going to come up here and introduce themselves in a moment and then introduce our speaker. So Sam and Arub, let me turn it over to you at this point.
Oops, sorry.
Hi everybody, my name is Sam Chambry. Like Bobby said, I'm a fellow in the graduate program, or the Brumley Graduate Fellowship Program. My home base is in the Latin American Studies Department, as well as the Community and Regional Planning Program with School of Architecture. And we've also got...
Hi, thanks a lot everyone for coming. I'm Suriela Arubisbal. I'm a master's student, a second-year master's student at LBJ School of Public Affairs. I'm doing a master's in global policy studies. And my research is mainly looking at local government institutions in South Asia, and I'm really excited to have Laipson here today.
Absolutely. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Ellen Laipson, who's going to talk to us about governance, security, and state fragility. Ellen is currently President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center. After serving as President and CEO at the Stimson Center from 2002 to just last month in October 2015. During her time at Stimson, she significantly expanded the research agenda at Stimson to broaden understanding of traditional security threats. Prior to her work at Stimson, Ellen served as the Vice Chair of the National Intelligence Council from 1997 to 2002, helping guide the intelligence community's transition into the 21st century during a time when that community was facing threats from everything including Y2K to deteriorating humanitarian conditions in Iraq and Afghanistan. She spent 25 years in government service prior to coming to Stimson, and that included positions with the State Department's Policy and Planning Staff, the National Security Council staff, and the Congressional Research Service. So it's really a treat to have her here with us today. And please join me in offering a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam and Arub, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry Paula can't join us. Paula's been a friend and a professional colleague of long standing, so I was really delighted to come and see her at UT, at the LBJ School. I've known Bob Hutchings. We had a Stimson associate that had graduated from this school, so I'm very happy to finally have a chance to meet you all and to see the school up close. And the Strauss Center in particular, I'm very interested in the fellowship program that you have, and happy to contribute if I can to this series. So our topic today, governance, security, and fragile states, is pulling together some big conceptual and practical challenges of the 21st century. I want to just alert you in advance, I don't have easy solutions to all of these issues, that we can kind of wallow together in how hard these problems are and what are some modest incremental ways to improve global governance. But I wanted you to know that my comments are in part driven by a large research project that Stimson just completed this year. We partnered with the Hague Institute for Global Justice, which, of course, sitting in The Hague is a global center for justice issues. It's where the criminal courts are. It's where 100 years ago the Court of Arbitration was created. There's a wonderful story of the Peace Palace of The Hague and how all of these evolving institutions for global justice sort of are centered there. They turned to the Stimson Center knowing that we take both innovative and pragmatic approaches to problems of international security, and said, we want you to be our partner as we think about the UN system, but not just the UN as a standalone institution, but global governance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. How can we better align in the 21st century the great challenges of enhancing security and justice? How do we connect those two large endeavors and make them more integrated. So we were very pleased to join as the partner of what we then called Confronting the Crisis of Global Governance. This was a commission that met on and off for a year, co-chaired by Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State of the U.S., and Ibrahim Gambari, former Foreign Minister, Perm Rep, and UN Undersecretary, Perm Rep and Foreign Minister of Nigeria, and UN Undersecretary for Political Affairs. So this was a great partnering. It turns out the two had both been graduate students at Columbia University together. And then we put together a panel that represented both the Perm 5 countries and the emerging powers of the Global South, knowing that we were not going to achieve an easy consensus on these big questions of global governance, but very much trying to push into an agenda between the UN's 70th and 75th birthdays. Can we help corral some of the big ideas about reforming global governance and identify where there is some overlapping agreement and move forward? We could not solve the problem of Security Council reform, I just want to tell you up front, but we certainly talked about it and tried to see where is there some common ground. But so when we structured this study, we were starting from a center of gravity that the problem of weak and fragile states is very dominant in the UN's agenda. So we know that global institutions do believe that while we don't face an existential threat of a great power war, we no longer fear that there will be a World War III. That, after all, is why the UN was created, to make sure there would not be World War III. So we don't worry about great geopolitical struggles. You might say, maybe we should. But for now, the UN really is preoccupied more with conflict and violence and great humanitarian tragedies that occur mostly in weak and fragile states. So we started assuming that we would talk about that and how can we fix the UN system. But we quickly agreed that we had to widen, similar to Sam's nice comment about my work at Stimson, how do you keep adapting your agenda to issues that may not have been seen as traditional security issues but are increasingly preoccupying governments around the world. So we decided we needed to grapple with climate change and how the global economy is so interconnected. Two issues for which the UN architecture is woefully inadequate. I mean, it's just abundantly clear that neither climate change nor the way globalization really works economically were issues at the time that the UN was created, and none of these big institutions of global governance really are equipped to deal with some of the security and justice implications of those challenges. So our study was really divided into these three large baskets, which were to test the proposition that we can improve the effectiveness, we can develop ideas that would lead to better outcomes and to help the UN and the UN system more broadly move in that direction. So let's start out with these three words: governance, security, and fragile states. And I thought my remarks will be roughly three broad issues. What's the current landscape of conflict, and how do we see these fragile states? Secondly, what's the capacity of global governance to respond? What are the current tools in the toolbox? And third would be what are some of the reforms ahead, and what is the prognosis for actually achieving consensus about those reforms and then eventually implementing them. So first, let's just make sure we all agree on what we're talking about with governance. We know that the international politics is divided into governments, which are sovereign state institutions. They are formal institutions run by laws, some democratic, some not so democratic. But governance is a more flexible and inclusive concept that really is about informal and consensual arrangements that may exist above governments or even at the subnational level, that governance happens at many levels of human interaction. But when we talk about global governance, we're clearly talking about something that is beyond the specific authorities of the components of the UN. It is also informal arrangements, ad hoc coalitions, creating new global norms, et cetera. It's some of the stuff that happens at the sort of margins within the UN system and even beyond the UN system. So we very much embraced the idea that in the 21st century, we want institutions to survive and perform competently, but we understand that a lot of decision-making and consensus building happens in more informal ways, ad hoc coalitions, whether it's how the landmines resolution got passed or the coalition for Yemen or for Afghanistan, that will use existing institutions and go beyond without undermining the core identity of those institutions, but saying these institutions alone are not sufficient. So we embrace the idea that governance includes civil society. It can include the private sector, although that is uneven, I would say, in its application, but certainly civil society are both inputs and players in achieving global governance outcomes. So that's our definition of governance, very inclusive. On security, we did, of course, debate. When the UN system was created, it was international peace and security. Okay, we get that. International peace and security means no more great wars, and that the UN is supposed to prevent any conflict, is supposed to intervene and manage conflicts. Prevent conflicts, nobody's been very good at that, but manage existing conflicts and help them wind down, that has been a core function of the UN. But obviously the definitions of security have widened considerably. I know a course is being taught on human security, and human security is sort of at the other end of the spectrum in a way. We were not questioning whether the nation-state system is still a viable unit of political action, so we are accepting that nation-states still exist, but we don't think that national security is the be-all and end-all. We do accept that security has to happen at many different levels, and societal security, what the Swedes have called societal security. Interesting story, it was the tsunami when Sweden realized there were 20,000 Swedes on the beaches of Thailand whose security was at risk, and they then began this very interesting national process of saying we have to provide security to our citizens no matter where they are. So they developed this concept of societal security. And then human security, of course, is the universal ideal objective. But our definition of security for purposes of this work was sufficient security so that individuals can pursue other things in their lives, okay? So that you are sufficiently secure. It doesn't mean that you've got $1 million in the bank, that you know your kids are going to go to college, that you can avoid chronic disease, but it's sufficiently secure so that you can pursue other ambitions, other goals in your life, so that security is not the overwhelming preoccupation of your waking hours. So we took a very, I would say, flexible and in a way universal definition of security, so that the aspirational goal is that human beings can not be profoundly insecure in their endeavors. Now, whether that security is provided by UN peacekeepers or by their government or by their family obviously is going to vary enormously across the globe. There's not one model that for security across the board, but we at least use that generic definition. And then fragile states, obviously there's many definitions, and I'll get to this in a minute, but so let me just define fragile states in a sec. But just about the Commission, we saw ourselves as part of many conversations that are taking place about improving global governance. We're not trying to compete with the other big projects. We're trying to identify where there are some shared ideas and goals. So we very much are enjoying taking the ideas in this report on the road to many different audiences. There have been events in Africa, in European capitals, at the UN, in Washington. I presented it in India at the Asian Forum for Global Governance 2 weeks ago. And I really do encourage you. There's a website that has not only the report, but some of the supporting research that looks into these three baskets of fragile states, climate change, and a global economy. And the website is it's governance, the Global Security Justice Governance.org. So one word, just with no punctuation, Global Security Justice Governance.org. And you can find all the supporting documents, and I think there's a lot of rich material. I want to just call out my colleague from Stimson, Bill Dirch, who is one of the national authorities on UN peacekeeping. He was the research director and the principal drafter of the study. So let's turn to the current landscape of conflict. We know that right now UN peacekeeping, and I'm going to keep pulling back to the UN instead of talking about these issues as if the UN is somehow a faraway factor. I'm going to try to keep pulling us back to how are we doing at the international level in managing these problems. So right now the UN peacekeepers are at the highest level they have ever been. There's 120,000 peacekeepers in 16 missions. In addition, there's 20,000 civilians attached to UN peace operations, and there's 20,000 soldiers of the African Union that are under UN umbrella in very creative and adaptive strategies to either in Mali and CAR and South Sudan to either pass the baton from the African Union to the UN or vice versa. So there's been a lot of new work being done on how the regional organizations, and particularly in Africa, step up to the plate and manage some of these crises, whether formally under a UN flag or as a regional organization with a UN mandate or a UN resolution that authorizes their work. The UN is in 16 countries. Near all of them are on the list. If you look at the Fragile States Index, which comes out every year, it just came out for 2015, this is only one of the big social science databases that exists to try to measure and identify where are weak and fragile states. But this is one that's now been around for over a decade. All of the UN peace operations, with the exception of Cyprus, are in the top tiers of the Fragile States Index. But there are fragile states that don't have a UN operation. So we don't want to assume a total correlation. Fragile states has 8 categories of fragility. Finland is alone in the totally sustainable category. The US is in the next to the best category with about 20 other countries. But at the top of the list, the very high alert and alert, South Sudan, Somalia, Central African Republic, Sudan, Congo, Chad, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. So, you see where the top 10 are. They're almost all places where the UN has been brought in. But we do have these problem cases. Yemen and Syria, actually, all the UN is able to do right now is humanitarian work. The UN is not involved yet, even if there's a political process that has not yet produced anything. We're at very early stages of imagining how a political operation could lead to approval of a peace mission that would allow the UN to be on the ground in those places. So we should understand that in some cases, some of the fragile states that have been fragile for a number of years, the UN is already on the ground and they're still fragile. And there are countries that are fragile that haven't yet invited the UN in, or the circumstances are not yet appropriate or congenial for the UN to play its role. So I think that we have to accept that fragile states are a part of the landscape. If out of 170 countries, maybe as many as 30 or 40 are deeply weak states, this is something that the international community is going to be grappling with indefinitely. There's not an easy solution given the factors and the indicators that push countries to be in this category. The Fragile States Index uses 12 indicators that are divided between social indicators of demography, how many refugees are you housing, etc. There are the second cluster of indicators are economic, obviously poverty, uneven economic development, maldistribution of income. And then the third cluster of indicators are political and military indicators. Does the state have legitimacy? What's the status of human rights and rule of law? And has there been an external intervention? So one of the things that we should say now is the spillover consequences of fragile states, that Sometimes fragile states become fragile because there's a war next door that causes an influx of refugees. Sometimes a fragile state spills over to somebody else. So this spillover dynamic is now being studied, maybe here in your own research, but I know that people are trying to understand better that spillover. How can you contain fragile states and work, within them to consolidate and strengthen their institutions? But how do we at least prevent fragile states from becoming regional conflicts? And I think the Great Lakes region of Africa, from the time that I worked at the U.S. mission to the UN in the mid-90s, the whole Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern DRC is a classic case of some of the spillover and the destabilizing effects, and the DRC to this day is still living with some of the consequences. So at least the UN and the intellectual leadership around in academic institutions is trying to understand better and stop some of the spillover dynamics, even if we cannot ensure that there will be no more weak and fragile states in the world. It is, a global reality in terms of maldistribution of natural resources, demographic pressures, and poor governance. And poor governance, in the end, has to happen within culturally meaningful units. It cannot be imposed from outside. So I personally am a realist on what some of the limits of the international community coming in and saying, isn't democracy the right thing for everybody? Not so much. And is there a sort of universal set of political principles that all countries are supposed to embrace? I think there will be a lot of reflection on the role of the international community in encouraging the referendum in South Sudan, for example. I mean, there was this celebration of creating a newly independent country, self-determination, sovereignty, isn't this great? And was that ever going to be a viable state? Are the reasons that South Sudan fell back into yet another version of a Sudanese civil war, were those factors that we should have known, could have known, did know in advance? Were we a little bit blinded by our enthusiasm at the political process that the UN managed to create the referendum for independence, and then missed some of the core dynamics? I think South Sudan is now a responsibility of the international community to some extent, but it does make us reflect on when we think that we can move in the direction of some universal values and norms. Sometimes there are cultural, political, ecological impediments to success. So I'm saying that I think that this concept of fragile states is a chronic reality. The international community is trying to get smarter about how to prevent and manage and intervene more successfully, but these issues are not going to go away, and I think they do become a core part of the function of international institutions, whether it's from humanitarian aid, economic development assistance, political assistance for elections, et cetera, and managing regional relations. So what is the capacity of the global governance institutions as we have them to respond? As I've given you a little bit of a flavor of peacekeeping, the next big thing was peace building. And I think our report suggests that there's a lot of conceptual confusion and a lack of consensus on what the agenda for peace building should be. I'm very drawn to peace building, which is to be in for the long haul, to help countries really stabilize. You do a lot of rule of law work. You do help make sure that there's appropriately trained police. You help build institutions, or you restore institutions. Sometimes you're building them from scratch. Sometimes you're trying to, rebuild institutions that had existed. So there's a peace-building commission. Our report says turn that peace-building commission into a council, make it a more authoritative part of the UN's architecture to make sure that peace-building becomes a more standard operating practice of the UN. But the receiving countries, and let me get to R2P, responsibility to protect and protection of civilians. Here's where the rub comes. As long as our international system is still based on sovereign states, there is an undertow of resistance to anything that appears to be sort of crossing a line of who owns the political future of a particular country. So, R2P was a Canadian and Australian. It was a very interesting post-Rwanda genocide prevention concept. The U.S. civil society did some remarkable things in building new literature about genocide prevention. Stimson was one of the core partners when the Holocaust Museum hosted the Genocide Prevention Task Force that, again, Madeleine Albright co-chaired, and produced a lot of original materials on, deeper understanding of genocide prevention. And that has been, the White House created a mass atrocities prevention task force. Some governments around the world have really embraced this concept of warning and prevention and early intervention. Guess what? It's harder to do than, you would have hoped. The receiving government can come up with 1,000 excuses of why you don't tell us how to run our country, and what you think are mass atrocities are really just a little bit of, garden variety violence. We can handle it. So there really isn't yet a successful tool for the international community to work on true early warning systems for genocide prevention. Everybody is alert to the challenge. There are new mechanisms that have not yet proven any guaranteed success. But the protection of civilians has become the new buzzword, which is a slightly gentler concept that allows the UN mandates to at least train the peacekeepers and to work with subnational groups, including civil society groups. Our own work, Stimson has actually done focus groups with small communities in South Sudan and the DRC, asking them, bottom up, sitting literally with, on the ground with affected communities, asking them whether the presence of the UN peacekeepers is making them feel more secure or not. And part of it is to give feedback to the UN that in some cases the presence of the peacekeepers is disrupting. It is changing social patterns of behavior. It is sometimes perceived as rewarding the combatants and not the society itself. And so one of the big ideas, and we'll get to this in a sec, is very much strengthening and diversifying who sits at the table when you're building these peace agreements. Counterterrorism and countering violent extremism are kind of new on the UN's docket, and they're trying very hard. I think there's a big need to integrate more peace building and countering violent extremism. Mali, for example, looked like a traditional peace operation, but the cross-border movement of violent extremists really made the mission a little bit different, and the UN is struggling with how to develop its own capabilities or with whom to work in a deeper and more strategic approach to countering violent extremism. It's one thing to say, here are armed bad guys, and we will try to authorize the capacity of the UN to go after them. They're not always successful in getting the authorization for the use of force. But there has to be a more strategic approach to countering violent extremism. The government of Saudi Arabia, you may know, gave over $100 million to the UN just to develop some new tools and techniques. There are now competing bureaucratic offices at the UN that are trying to figure out how to help countries do capacity building for counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. But I think we are on the cusp of something that tries to look more holistically at both underlying causes and dealing with the actual manifestations of violence in these places. Again, I think countering violent extremism is a very tricky area for the UN because it's sometimes deeply cultural, may come from faith communities, may not, may be a misuse of faith communities, but it does have some cultural specificity that one can imagine the UN could set some rules that would not be appropriate in many places. So let me turn to the last topic about do we see changes up ahead. So when I was at the Asian Forum for Global Governance, this is a project that's been running for 5 years between the Indian think tank, the Observer Research Foundation, and a German think tank, the Zeitstiftung. And they bring young professionals, some of you may be interested in this, people from 30 to 35, so it's not student age, but people who are already starting their professional careers from many countries, and they work together kind of in teams for almost 2 weeks, I think, to look at problems of global governance. And Shashi Tharoor created this program. He had worked in the UN for 30 years and is certainly seen as a kind of liberal reformer, both in India and at the UN. And so he talked a lot about the crises of legitimacy, representativeness, and authority of the UN system. So, you know, this transition to the 21st century, but this hangover of the permanent five with this exceptional power and authority that they have, the unwillingness or inability to make the UN Security Council more representative, the fact that most of the clout at the UN is at the Security Council and not in the General Assembly. All of these issues from an Indian perspective are unacceptable. And so, you know, certainly countries of the Global South have made it very clear, really, really, it's time for change. And the permanent five members are, of course, half deaf in sort of not wanting to listen too much to this debate. But China plays a very interesting role here. And China certainly could be the bridge country. If China, as both a permanent five member with the veto and a Global South emerging great power, could help set the agenda for UN reform, I think it could be very powerful. So, you know, I think that at the 70th anniversary, I would argue that the mood was a little bit sober, that the UN accepts that it's not moving forward, it's not successfully necessarily making the world a more peaceful place, but there is some genuine satisfaction that on the Millennium Development Goals, those 15, the goals that were established in 2000 and have now been retired and turned into the Sustainable Development Goals of the next 15 years, that in fact poverty is down, that there are some, you know, laudable changes that have occurred because that process generated more international cooperation. So on the development, humanitarian, specialized agency side of the UN, I think there's some satisfaction that the system is getting smarter and more effective. The migration crisis from Africa and the Middle East to Europe, of course, is stretching the system to a breaking point, and one should not be complacent that the UN has the resources or the structural capacity to manage that. But on worldwide poverty, some of the worldwide indicators of development and access to services, access to clean water, access to you know, power, et cetera, some of the arrows are pointing in the right direction. But again, a sober mood, because this question of representativeness and inclusiveness and who has the authority to make decisions has not been advanced sufficiently. In our report, we tried to be both aspirational and pragmatic. We said, let's identify some changes that are achievable so that we don't come back in 10 years and say, well, that sounded good, but we actually score a 0 in implementing them. We are looking for things in a medium, low to medium range that are achievable. So on the specific question of fragile states, among our reforms were to really push the UN office, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, to plan better, a greater investment in the planning and prevention functions that it has, very strong push for gender attentiveness, which is really across the board. It's not just you know, pay attention to women as victims of these conflicts, but it's women as peacemakers, it's women as higher in the UN system. There need to be more women SRSGs, special representatives, as the negotiators and the interveners in conflict. But I feel, you know, more women in police forces, in law and order, you know, rule of law institutions in these countries, but certainly women at the peace table, that the concept that a peace table after a civil war is to bring the combatants together and tell them to put down their arms is so inadequate. You need also the people at the table who kept the society together in spite of the fighting. And women as civil society leaders are very important players there. So very strong push. Jane Hall-Lute, who was an Deputy Undersecretary of the UN, was then the deputy of our Department of Homeland Security, is now quite involved in cyber issues. Jane pushed very hard for this. She ran the newly created UN Office for Peace Operations, the sort of peace support that the UN does, the logistics and all of the kind of infrastructure support that goes into peace operations. So women, planning, more resources, and more integration of effort. And I do think, like all bureaucracies, like the US, whether you're talking about the Defense Department or intelligence, or maybe even at universities, when you're trying to promote cross-disciplinary work as opposed to single discipline, the UN has the same crying need. How do you get your political, your humanitarian, and your security folks to be part of an integrated team? How do they learn to look more holistically at the challenges ahead and divide up the labor, but do it in a way that they are aware of what the others are doing? So, you know, I see an international system that in some ways is getting smarter. There are more and more players, and I think we do have to also be aware that as we integrate and as we include more of the stakeholders in these processes, there is always the problem that we create a porousness, or we diffuse authority too much. How do you get the balance right between knowing who can make decisions versus letting everybody think they're a decision maker, and therefore not knowing who's going to make the judgment call when a decision needs to be made. So I see this as a push-pull challenge that is ongoing. More inclusiveness, yes, but still enough clarity about authority so that some of the hard decisions in the field can be made. There's another argument that certainly comes up in national governments as well. You know, let the field do what the field can, and don't make headquarters an obstacle to action. So I think that's another challenge for the UN. But so I'm trying to strike a note that's not totally pessimistic, that I do see this as an ongoing core function of the international system, global governance. Things we can be smart, we can study and analyze these problems. No guarantee that how do you get that knowledge to true consensus building among member states that are still going to pull back a little bit on how much they really want the UN to have the action. So on that, you know, ambiguous note, I will finish, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes.
Given your concerns about the implications of international validation of secession movements as we South Sudan, I'm interested in how you think the international community should address for focusing and balancing national state capacity while recognizing that some subnational units might have more institutional coherence.
Right.
Capabilities, things like Uganda or Somaliland and Somalia. There are other examples that maybe parallel there.
So let me, I mean, I don't want us to overdraw a lesson of South Sudan. Just because it has not turned out to be a success story yet in South Sudan doesn't mean that it can't someday, and should not impede us from, you know, East Timor became independent, but there aren't too many of these cases left. I mean, Western Sahara maybe, but, you know, the UN may just sit there in the sand for forever and ever, and it'll never get resolved. But so I don't want to suggest that we should overlearn the lesson of South Sudan, but I do think that in some cases, you know, decentralization within existing borders is the compromise choice. I mean, in Iraq, for example, the autonomy of the Kurdish region. In the end, I think the Kurds will become an independent country, but it won't be pretty getting there. But so I do think that we see worldwide. I mean, Pakistan has been doing a big decentralization exercise. The problem with too much decentralization is then you don't have a coherent national identity. But I do think, you know, distribution of power to units that can handle it. Sometimes national governments are just incompetent at delivering services in the remoter parts of their countries, and whether you can, you know, use federalism and other forms of decentralization and greater authority to subnational units, that's a way to go. I don't think changing borders is that easy. I think we all can envision a different map of the Middle East, for example, but I do think there's both inertia and there's counter pressures to thinking that changing borders is necessarily the solution. So I guess that's as much as I can say. Yes?
So, thanks so much for your talk. It was really broad and deep at the same time. So my question is about this increasing cognizance that fragile states have largely fallen through some of the efforts to improve to these global standards, right? So with MDBs, there's been a lot of progress globally, as you noted, and yet many of the fragile states have not made as much progress on those. And there's an increasing movement at the international level through the new 7+ and through the SDGs to focus more on fragility specifically. And I think the same gap has happened within U.S. policy. Asian some efforts to, including MCC, was focused on those countries that have good enough
Already
governance
made
capacity,
progress, right.
to be able to enter into those compacts, but fragile states don't often make it over that threshold. And yet they also don't fall into stability operations. So fragile states have somehow in some ways fallen through the cracks of U.S. policy. So I just would be interested in your thoughts of the climate looking there right now, or what efforts moving forward in this.
Well, I'm not convinced that the U.S. should be the prime actor or the lead actor in all of these fragile states. So I think we do have to be selective. I personally think the MCC is a really interesting and effective process, but it should not be seen as, it's very different than the poorest of the poor. It's trying to, look at Tunisia. So Tunisia graduated from being an aid recipient, and then it sort of falls off the cliff. MCC allows a country to stay with access to the U.S., funding mechanisms, whether it's, guaranteed loans or whatever, and you celebrate their success. It's very hard for countries to qualify as Millennium Challenge Corporation. This was a Bush administration idea that was really a very interesting alternative way to think about economic development. So it turns out that AID then gets to deal with the harder cases in a way. But so I don't have an answer for you. I don't think that the U.S. Believes that we have a standalone formula or solution. I think in the end there is a competition for resources. A lot of other aid donors, the Dutch, the Brits, the Nordics, are all saying we're going to work in fewer countries. We're not going to try to be everywhere. We'll pick 7 countries and we'll just focus on them, and then we want to see results. But if we disperse our money that everybody gets a little bit, then you have nothing to show for it. So I think there's a trend to be more selective, and so maybe the UN will have to adjudicate a little bit and say, oops, we're neglecting these 3 countries in Southeast Asia. But in the end, countries go where there are interests and where there's opportunities. The East Asians, Korea and Japan, really care about Cambodia and Laos, for example. We don't have to pay for, why should the U.S. always be the lead? So there is a kind of interesting division of labor. Look at what the Dutch have done. The Dutch have, I think, picked 7 countries. They said we're no longer, they're closing up their aid missions in countries and saying we want to concentrate more in places where we know we have an interest and where we think we can make a difference. Yes?
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. I think a lot of the architecture that you're talking about seems to be largely focused on questions of conflict. I'm wondering if you could say more about the vision that the report had about development in this process. I'm thinking specifically in the context of climate change.
Yeah.
It seems like having a primary security-focused approach to that sort of leads to crisis which already becomes fairly dire. So how does development do this?
So for today I very intentionally said just fragile states, and then I said there's these 2 other baskets. I'm not going to talk about them. I actually thought that our theme of security and justice was most compelling in fragile states and of diminishing, logic when it comes to climate change and the economic basket. That we really had trouble setting the parameters for that globalization basket. It wasn't only cyber. It was kind of how economic transactions now happen without regard to national borders. Who governs that space? So we talked about 3 spaces, by the way. I should have said this earlier. There's the public space, which is the political space of the nation states. There's the ecological space, which is climate change, which has to be addressed at the collective level. It cannot be addressed at the nation-state level. And then there's the transactional space, which is, the way money and goods and services just move without respect to borders anymore. So so again, we were trying to zoom in on what are the security and justice components. We were not trying to have a comprehensive view of everything that needs to be done. But I don't know if I'm addressing the spirit of your question, but I think that we were very aware, in a way, the injustice of climate change is deeply about economics. It's about, winners and losers and have-nots, and what's the responsibility of the international community to ensure that the losers of climate change have some recourse, and where's the responsibility for that? And I think, our argument is that really, and it's so interesting to talk to the people at the UN who work on climate issues who said, oh no, we know what we're doing, you can leave us alone. We give grants every year to scientists, and that's our mission, that's what we're supposed to do. Completely missing the point that this is now a global existential issue, and you guys giving your grants every year is really not is not sufficient. There has to be a much bigger think about how do you set global norms, and whether these painful negotiations in what's upcoming in Paris are also sort of an exercise in futility. So we were trying to pull out from the climate change experts some ideas that we thought were more dynamic, a little bit less focused on nation states. We're interested in subnational units taking a role in climate change compliance, that you could have municipalities, or you could have mayors of cities forming a coalition on mega cities in climate change. You can have, corporations endorse principles on how they're going to behave. It really is, the nation state is a clumsy unit to deal with climate change. So, we were trying to push a little bit the conceptual thinking, but we weren't trying to grapple with all of the dimensions of climate change. Yes?
The way you set forth human security.
Yes.
Could Putin use your concept to justify his actions against the Ukraine and Crimea on the standpoint of increasing security for the Russian-speaking peoples there?
Well, I guess he could, but then you have a disadvantaged population in the same territory. So you do have people whose security is adversely affected by the Russians strutting around with guns, So fair enough. I mean, maybe this definition does include, how a strong non-democratic state could position itself. We don't want the public, we don't want, gangs and bands of armed civilians. We'll take that responsibility. We, the authoritarian state, will provide security so the rest of you don't have to. But I think we would say that in a coercive environment, it doesn't meet our definition of security. If it's too coercive, if people are not given enough space to pursue their own interests as individuals, then it would not meet our criteria. Yes?
Well, let's ask you sort of a philosophical question, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, and I'm just tossing around what you say today. You have fragile states which need to be better states. That if they were better states, the humans inside them would be more secure. And then we have the need for collective action, and in some cases, recognition of external authorities that maybe supersede sovereignty as a prescription in some other areas. So what are we talking about where we're going with states and the concept of sovereignty to make all this work?
Well, look, I think the European Union, some people believed that they were the vanguard of a 21st century world in which sovereignty at the national level would become just less important. It wouldn't go away entirely, but borders are more porous, and some countries are willing to give up their sovereignty in the pursuit of a collective good. The migration crisis, I think, is really exposing that not all the Europeans made it all the way mentally to the European Union, or that it's a generational project. Well, I mean, in fairness to them, it is a generational project. I mean, they're trying to do both. They're trying to retain national and cultural identity, and they're trying to put as many functions as they can at the supranational level. So, I mean, I think there were moments where the European experiment was the vanguard experiment. I look at the Gulf Cooperation Council. I just wrote I write a column for the World Politics Review. And, you know, the GCC, you can see that they tense up when you talk about the European Union to them. Why don't you guys think more about some of the things the European Union has done? And you can tell that they kind of recoil a bit because they're very young countries. You know, they were only, I mean, the UAE has only been a country since 1971, so they're still, you know, making sure that all school children know the flag and know the national anthem, and, you know, they're building national identity. They're not ready to give up sovereignty. But there are parts of the world in which integration would be the logical, smart thing to do. I mean, I think the North African countries should pursue economic integration. There's no way, but because of their political differences, they can't even begin the conversation. You know, they've passed resolutions for 30 years saying that eventually there'll be a Maghreb Union. But they can't even get to the first step because Algeria and Morocco won't talk to each other. You know, I mean, they do talk to each other, but on this issue, it's just too sensitive for them. Whereas, so I still believe that we will see more integration, and that sovereignty was never intended to be, you know, if you, Steve Krasner out at Stanford writes about sovereignty, that, you know, the original concept was not intended to be a straitjacket. It wasn't intended to be this, you know, iron clad uniform that you, once you put it on, you can never ever do anything else. That it can be a more porous and elastic concept. And I would have thought that nations, you know, when you see that you can't tax, you know, economic activity that happens on the internet. If I buy a rug from Turkey on the internet, you know, who pays taxes on that? So there's many ways in which the authority of the nation state has already eroded, but they don't want to acknowledge it. And so I still think that some forms of integration is going to be a big 21st century story. But I don't think the concept of sovereignty will ever go away. And again, as I said before, and this is my own inconsistency, I don't think changing borders is necessarily, you know, easy or sufficient to solve some of these problems. But again, the UN system will look increasingly anachronistic if they come up with ideas and then they completely stall out all the time because they can't get enough countries to vote in favor of something that they know has to be done. Okay, so I do think that the way in which the UN will start to look obsolete is if their, you know, one nation, one vote system turns out to be kind of a permanent blockage for them to promote more collective action when needed. I'm not sure I answered your question, but yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. So, well, I think the UN is struggling with this, and I think they haven't figured. After 9/11, there were a few big UN resolutions passed that tried to define, and it was clear that you know, the Muslim world really fought over how we were going to define terrorism. Of, you know, what's the range of behavior that would be called terrorist that didn't appear to be singling out one group. That terrorism could, of course, present itself in any culture. So there was a real struggle after 9/11, but they did set some big global requirements. So all countries are obliged to report that they have certain, you know, security measures so that terrorists couldn't get access to WMD materials. And a lot of think tanks have been working on this. It's Resolution 1540. It's created a whole industry of people helping countries of the global south that are not interested in WMD at all, but they still have to report to the UN what are they doing to secure any illicit materials from possibly getting, you know, so it's about strengthening border security and customs and training judges, and it's had a lot of programmatic activity. But I think I think that the UN doesn't quite know how to grapple with, they would still argue that some of their development work addresses some of the underlying causes. You could argue that the Sustainable Development Goals certainly address some of the underlying factors that have caused terrorism. But I think the UN is very reluctant to authorize military action against extremist groups, asymmetric warfare, if you will. I think that's very hard for the UN to endorse. So, so much of the counterterrorism has been coalitions of NATO countries, and now the Saudis have led a coalition in Yemen that is struggling a bit because I don't think they've achieved their military objectives. So I think this is an ongoing issue for the UN, but there are not clear authorities, and it doesn't fit easily into the kinds of resolutions that the Security Council passes for peace operations. It sits uncomfortably outside of kind of the existing practices of the UN, but is something they increasingly are saying we need to address. So the Saudi fund, there's a Saudi fund, and then there's another fund that is, in theory, capacity building, but it's back to your point, it a little bit strengthens authoritarians. I mean, right now that money goes to strengthening states that are, for the most part, not democratic states, to prevent terrorism within their borders. It's not necessarily a long-term solution. But I think that, so far, that's the piece that the UN has bitten off. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that more investment should go into prevention as one of the solutions. And I was wondering if you could mention more what the UN strategies are in place right now for preventing the fragile states from slipping into the domain of failed states, and where do you think the loopholes are and what can be done?
Well, I think that prevention at the national level and at the UN level will always be a goal, and it's very, very hard to get bureaucracies to actually do prevention. I mean, I think that it never gets the priority until something bad has happened, and you can see all the indicators in the world, but you can't necessarily get a decision to act. And so we can think of prevention in a much looser way so that, every economic development activity is a prevention activity to some extent. But I'm talking about something that's closer to the outbreak of violence. Can you get agreement to send in a peace mission, to deconflict opposing groups, et cetera? And I don't think the UN, I think the UN's deep ambivalence about intelligence is a problem. They don't want member states, they don't know how to receive warning information from member states. That's extremely sensitive for the UN. They don't want to develop an intelligence function. The US has been telling them for decades, either take information from member states or develop some analytic capacity at the UN. I was involved in the mid-90s in trying to strengthen the information capabilities of the Information Center of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and we were authorized to share warning information directly. I didn't have to wait for it to be reformatted as a releasable to the UN. I could bring warning information about threats to peacekeepers and threats to UN missions directly to the UN. So that was, one initiative, and it still exists. Some people believe that the intelligence function of the UN should sit in the Department of Political Affairs, and that they should just have an analytic unit that does the warning, and they should have a capacity to engage member states. We set up, when I was vice chairman of the NIC, we set up an exercise that was terrific for a while, as long as it lasted. We brought INR from the State Department and NIOs. Anyway, we had the US mission host. All the undersecretaries of the UN were invited, and we would do this worldwide threat engagement with them. And once they got comfortable with it, they were telling us, there's a huge insight from the UN experts that are deployed in the field so that you could help them triage, because the NIC started to do this complex humanitarian emergencies estimate every other year, which was a warning exercise. And we wanted to help the UN, but it required them, you couldn't tell that it was uncomfortable for them to take this kind of input from the US, and they had to figure out, is there some comparable way we can get this input from other member states so that it's politically neutral for us? But I think that's a big barrier to the prevention goal, is their resistance to having an in-house analytic warning capacity. And they don't want the US alone. There's got to be a way to get multiple member states to help them perform that function. Yes?
So I hope this isn't redundant, but kind of what you're talking about. So we talked